My name is Isabella Moreau, and if you ask anyone in the Ashworth family, I'm the charity case their golden son, Marcus, married out of pity. It was their monthly family dinner at Belmont's, the most exclusive restaurant in downtown Silverbrook, and the mahogany tables gleamed under crystal chandeliers while soft jazz floated through air thick with the scent of truffle oil and aged wine. I'd chosen my outfit carefully that evening, a midnight blue dress with subtle silver threading. Modest but elegant, the kind of dress that whispered rather than shouted. Still, I might as well have walked in wearing a paper bag with outsider stamped across the front. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Ashworth family had claimed their usual private dining room, the Venetian Suite with its hand-painted murals and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's twinkling skyline. Everything about this place screamed old money, from the imported Italian marble floors to the original oil paintings adorning the walls. This wasn't just dinner, it was a monthly ritual, a display of status and tradition that stretched back 3 generations of Ashworth gatherings. I'd been part of these dinners for 2 years now, ever since Marcus and I married in what his mother, Vivian Ashworth, had called a quaint little ceremony. Translation: too small, too simple, too beneath their standard. But I'd learned to navigate their world of subtle insults wrapped in silk scarves and backhanded compliments, served with vintage champagne. Marcus, my husband of 2 years, sat at the head of the table in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his sandy hair combed back in that effortless way that came from a lifetime of personal grooming and privilege. He was discussing quarterly projections with his father, Reginald Ashworth, while his sister Cordelia picked at her salmon tartare and complained about the help at her country club. The conversation flowed around topics I'd heard 1,000 times: stock portfolios, vacation homes in the Hamptons, charity galas where the real purpose was being photographed in the society pages. I'd met Marcus 3 years ago at a business conference in Chicago. He'd been representing Ashworth and Associates, the family's investment firm, while I was there for... Well, that's where things got complicated. Marcus knew I worked in the restaurant industry, but the details had somehow gotten lost in translation, or maybe I'd been deliberately vague. Either way, his family had filled in the blanks with their own assumptions, and those assumptions painted me as everything they expected. A server who'd gotten lucky, a waitress who'd caught their son's eye, a working-class girl who'd stumbled into their gilded world. The truth was more complex, but I'd learned that the Ashworths preferred simple narratives. It made it easier for them to categorize people, to know exactly where everyone belonged in their carefully constructed hierarchy. "Isabella, darling," Vivian's voice cut through my thoughts like a perfectly sharpened knife, wrapped in velvet. She sat across from me, her silver hair styled in an elegant chignon, wearing a cream Chanel suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. "You're so quiet tonight. I hope the atmosphere isn't too intimidating for you." The way she said intimidating made it clear she hoped it was. Vivian Ashworth had perfected the art of the charitable insult, phrasing put-downs as concern, delivering cruelty with a sympathetic smile. "Not at all," I replied smoothly, taking a sip of the Bordeaux they'd ordered without consulting me. "It's a beautiful restaurant." "Oh yes, Belmont's is simply divine," she continued, her pale blue eyes glinting with something that wasn't quite warm. "Of course, it's probably quite different from the places you're used to working." There it was, the reminder delivered with surgical precision. Working, not dining, not enjoying, not belonging. Work. Cordelia, Marcus's younger sister, looked up from her phone with barely concealed amusement. At 28, she had the kind of effortless beauty that came from good genes and better skincare, her auburn hair falling in perfect waves over her designer blazer. "Mother, you're being dramatic. I'm sure Isabella has been to nice restaurants before." She turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Haven't you, Isabella, when you were serving at them?" The table went quiet for just a moment, not the heavy silence of shock, but the lighter pause of anticipation. They were waiting to see how I'd react, whether I'd shrink back or defend myself. It was a test I'd taken dozens of times before. Marcus cleared his throat, finally looking up from his business discussion. "Cordelia, that's unnecessary. It's not shameful to work in service." Cordelia protested with false innocence. I think it's admirable, actually. Very honest work. Honest work. Another perfectly crafted insult disguised as praise. I smiled, the same serene expression I'd worn to every one of these dinners. You're absolutely right. There's nothing shameful about any honest work. Reginald, who'd been silent up to this point, adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and studied me with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating investment. Isabella, remind me again, which restaurant did you work at before you met Marcus? It was a trap, of course. They'd asked this question before, in various forms, trying to pin down exactly which establishment had been lucky enough to employ me. I'd always deflected, changed the subject, or given vague answers that could mean anything. Several places, actually, I said, cutting into my duck breast with practiced ease. The restaurant industry is quite fluid. Oh, I'm sure it is. Vivian agreed with that sympathetic tone again. All that moving around, never quite settling anywhere. It must have been so exhausting, working on your feet all day. The assumptions hung in the air like expensive perfume, heavy, suffocating, and impossible to escape. They'd decided my story long before I'd had a chance to tell it. The struggling waitress, the ambitious server who'd set her sights on their son, the working-class girl who'd hit the matrimonial lottery, and I'd let them believe. Not because I was ashamed of my truth, but because I'd wanted to see who they really were when they thought no one was watching. I'd wanted to understand the people my husband had grown up with, the family whose approval he still craved, despite being 32 years old. Marcus reached over and squeezed my hand, a gesture meant to be supportive, but somehow felt more like an apology. He'd never defended me with any real conviction, never challenged his family's assumptions, never demanded they treat me with the respect a wife deserved. He loved me, I knew that, but his love came with conditions, with the quiet expectation that I'd adapt, adjust and accept whatever his family chose to dish out. Well, I said, setting down my fork and looking around the table at these people who'd spent 2 years treating me like an interloper in their golden kingdom. I suppose everyone has their assumptions about the restaurant business. Little did they know as they sat there in their designer clothes, sipping wine that cost more than most people's weekly salary, making jokes about my supposed background in food service, that every bite they took, every sip they enjoyed, every moment of luxury they savored in this exclusive dining room, was happening with my explicit permission, because what the Ashworth family didn't know, what Marcus himself didn't fully understand, was that the restaurant they'd chosen for their monthly displays of superiority, the establishment they'd been frequenting for over a decade, the place where they felt most comfortable looking down on people like me, belonged to me. Every crystal glass, every piece of silverware, every chair they sat in, every course that emerged from the kitchen, all of it was mine. And tonight that was about to change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first real tension of the evening began when our server, a young man named David who couldn't have been more than 25, approached our table with practiced professionalism. He wore the standard Belmont's uniform, crisp white shirt, black vest, perfectly knotted tie, and moved with the kind of careful precision that came from months of training in fine dining service. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start anyone with cocktails or perhaps wine from our reserve collection? Vivian didn't even look up from her menu. We'll have the usual, she said dismissively, waving her manicured hand as if shooing away a fly. The Chateau Margaux. And make sure it's properly decanted this time. Last month's service was adequate at best. David nodded politely. Of course, Mrs. Ashworth. I'll speak with our sommelier immediately. See that you do, Reginald added, adjusting his gold watch with an air of superiority. At these prices, we expect perfection, not adequacy. I watched David's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that probably went unnoticed by everyone else at the table, but I'd learned to read the subtle signs of service staff under pressure, the tiny moments where professionalism masked frustration. Absolutely, sir. I'll ensure everything meets your expectations tonight. As David walked away, Cordelia let out a small laugh. Did you see how nervous he looked? These young servers always seem so overwhelmed when they have to deal with discerning clientele. It's the training, Vivian explained to me, as if I were a student in need of education. Most of these establishments hire people who simply don't understand the nuances of proper service. They're used to casual dining, chain restaurants, that sort of thing. She paused, her pale blue eyes fixing on me with calculated precision. Of course, I'm sure you understand that better than most of us, Isabella, having worked in the industry yourself. There it was, the first direct strike. Not quite an insult, but a reminder of my supposed place in the social hierarchy. The implication was clear: I should empathize with David, because we were cut from the same cloth, both of us working-class people trying to navigate a world of wealth and privilege. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mother, I don't think. Oh, it's perfectly fine, dear, Vivian interrupted with that practiced smile. I'm simply acknowledging Isabella's experience. There's no shame in understanding how these things work from the other perspective. Cordelia nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. Isabella probably has all sorts of insights about restaurant service. Don't you, Isabella? You must have dealt with difficult customers all the time. The assumption hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar. They weren't asking about my experience. They were confirming their narrative. In their minds, I was the former waitress who dealt with people like them, people who demanded perfection and complained when they didn't get it. Every industry has its challenges, I replied carefully, taking another sip of water. The key is understanding what really matters to people. How diplomatic, Reginald observed, though his tone suggested he found my answer lacking in specificity. But surely, you have some story. Some particularly demanding customers who tested your patience. The way he phrased it made it clear he expected me to regale them with tales of my supposed servitude, perhaps some amusing anecdotes about dealing with entitled diners. It was a request disguised as curiosity, but really it was an invitation for me to confirm their assumptions about my background. David returned with the wine, presenting the bottle to Reginald with a formal bow of his head. The Chateau Margaux, 2015, sir. Shall I pour for tasting? Obviously, Reginald replied curtly. As David went through the ritual of opening and presenting the wine, I noticed his hands were slightly shaking, whether from nervousness or frustration, I couldn't tell, but the Ashworth's demanding attitude was clearly affecting him. When David poured the small taste for Reginald, I watched my father-in-law swirl it with exaggerated importance, sniff it like he was judging a wine competition, and take a small sip that he rolled around his mouth far longer than necessary. It's acceptable, he finally pronounced, as if he were granting a royal pardon, though the temperature could be slightly cooler. Perhaps your wine storage isn't quite what it should be. David's professional mask slipped for just a fraction of a second. I apologize, sir. I can certainly discuss storage temperatures with our sommelier, if you'd like. That won't be necessary, Vivian interjected with false kindness. We're not here to educate your staff, though heaven knows they could use it. The dismissive comment hit its mark. David's shoulders tensed, and for a moment, I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of myself at countless family gatherings. The quiet frustration of being treated as less than human by people who considered themselves superior. Isabella, Cordelia said suddenly, turning to me with bright, malicious interest. You must have some opinion about the service here. Professional insight, as it were. It was a trap, elegantly. If I criticized David or the restaurant, I'd be joining their elitist chorus and betraying my supposed working-class roots. If I defended the service, I'd be going against their established narrative and risking their displeasure. But there was a third option, one they hadn't considered. Actually, I said slowly, setting down my wine glass with deliberate care, I think the service here is exceptional. David is clearly well-trained, professional, and attentive. The wine selection is outstanding, the ambiance is perfect, and the attention to detail is remarkable. The table went quiet, not because my response was shocking, but because it was unexpected. They'd expected me to either criticize the service, proving I understood their standards, or make excuses for it, proving my working-class loyalty. Instead, I'd given an assessment that was both knowledgeable and confident. Well, Vivian said after a moment, her smile becoming slightly strained, I suppose different people have different standards. The implication was clear: my standards were lower because of my background. I was easily impressed because I wasn't accustomed to true luxury. Marcus finally spoke up, though his voice lacked conviction. Isabella knows good service when she sees it. She's actually quite discerning. Of course she is, darling, his mother replied with patronizing sweetness. I'm sure working in restaurants gave her a very practical understanding of what constitutes good service. That word practical was loaded with meaning, not sophisticated, not refined, not educated, practical. The kind of understanding that came from necessity rather than breeding, from experience rather than entitlement. As David returned to take our dinner orders, I made a decision. The subtle condescension, the casual dismissal, the constant reminders of my supposed place, it was time to stop accepting it all with grace and dignity, but I wouldn't confront them directly, not. Instead, I would watch, listen, and remember every slight, every assumption, every moment they chose cruelty over kindness, because what they didn't know was that their behavior tonight wasn't just being observed by a former server who should be grateful for their acceptance. It was being observed by their host, and I was taking notes. The situation deteriorated rapidly after we placed our order. What started as subtle jabs and condescending remarks evolved into something far more pointed and personal, and I found myself watching a masterclass in cruelty disguised as family conversation. It began when David returned with our appetizers, pan-seared scallops with cauliflower puree for the table except for Cordelia, who'd ordered the caviar service. As he carefully placed each plate with practiced precision, Reginald decided to launch into what he probably considered an educational moment. "David, isn't it?" he said, not waiting for confirmation. "Tell me, how long have you been working here?" David paused, clearly uncertain whether this was genuine interest or something else. "About 8 months, sir." 8 months, Reginald repeated thoughtfully, cutting into his scallop with surgical precision. "And before Belmont's, where did you work?" "I was at Riverside Grill downtown, sir. And before that, I worked at a family restaurant in Millbrook while I was finishing my hospitality degree." "Ah," Vivienne interjected with false brightness. "Working your way up, how admirable. That's exactly the kind of determination we need to see more of in young people today." But her tone suggested the opposite, that David's journey was both predictable and somehow lesser than whatever path she imagined for people of her social class. Cordelia looked up from her caviar with renewed interest. "A hospitality degree? How practical. I suppose that teaches you all about dealing with difficult customers." "Among other things," David replied diplomatically, though I could see his grip tighten slightly on the serving tray. "Oh, I'm sure Isabella could tell you stories about that," Vivienne said, turning to me with that sharp smile that never reached her eyes. "The things you must have endured, dear. Rude customers, impossible demands, people who thought they were better than you simply because they had money." The irony was so thick, I could have cut it with my dinner knife. Here she was, describing exactly the behavior she was demonstrating, while completely oblivious to her own actions. "People can be challenging," I agreed, neutrally, watching David's face carefully. He was beginning to understand that this conversation wasn't really about him, it was about me, and he was simply a prop in their little performance. "Challenging," Reginald chuckled. "Such a diplomatic way to put it. I imagine you encountered your fair share of entitled customers, who thought their money gave them the right to treat staff poorly." Again, the complete lack of self-awareness was staggering. Marcus finally tried to intervene. "Perhaps we could talk about something else." "This seems nonsense," his mother cut him off sharply. "This is fascinating. Isabella so rarely talks about her past, and David here is living it right now. It's like a real-time case study in service industry dynamic." She turned back to David, who was clearly trying to figure out how to escape this increasingly uncomfortable situation. "Tell me, David, what's the most difficult situation you've encountered here at Belmont's?" David glanced at me, then back at Vivienne, clearly trapped. "Well, ma'am, every situation is different. We're trained to handle various challenges with professionalism." "Oh, come now," Cordelia pressed, dabbing caviar onto a mother-of-pearl spoon. "Surely you've had some impossible customer. People who think they're royalty, who demand special treatment, who complain about everything." The questions were becoming more pointed, more aggressive. They were essentially asking David to describe difficult customers, while being difficult customers themselves, and the poor young man was caught in an impossible position. We prefer to focus on providing excellent service to all our guests, replied carefully. But I could see sweat beginning to form at his temples despite the restaurant's perfect climate control. How refreshingly positive, Vivian said with obvious sarcasm. But surely, Isabella, you can share some stories. You must have dealt with people who thought they were superior to you, who treated you like you were invisible, who acted like your sole purpose was to serve their every whim. Her words hit like a physical blow, not because they described my past, but because they described my present. She was literally doing everything she was asking me to condemn, treating both David and me like we existed solely for her entertainment and validation. Some people do struggle with basic courtesy, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. Exactly, Reginald exclaimed, as if I'd just proven his point. It's a matter of breeding, really. Proper upbringing teaches you how to interact with service staff appropriately. Not everyone has that advantage. The condescension was now flowing freely, and David was trapped in the middle of it, forced to stand there and listen to them discuss service workers like they were a different species entirely. Speaking of service, Cordelia said suddenly, snapping her fingers at David like he was a dog, could you bring me some fresh lemon for the caviar? And make sure it's properly chilled this time. David nodded and hurried away, clearly grateful for any excuse to escape their presence, even temporarily. The moment he was gone, the conversation took an even darker turn. Poor boy, Vivian said with false sympathy. You can see he's trying so hard. But there's something about people from that background. They just don't have the natural grace that comes with proper breeding. It's not his fault, Cordelia added charitably. Some people are born to serve, others are born to be served. It's simply the natural order of things. Marcus looked increasingly uncomfortable. Cordelia, that's a bit harsh. Is it? His sister challenged. I'm not being cruel, I'm being realistic. Look at Isabella. She understands this better than anyone. She's lived in both worlds now. Haven't you, Isabella? All eyes turned to me and I realized this was the moment they'd been building toward all evening. They wanted me to acknowledge my place, to confirm their worldview, to validate their sense of superiority by admitting that I was grateful to have been elevated from my supposed station. Both worlds, I repeated slowly. Exactly. Vivian nodded enthusiastic. The world of working for people like us, and now the world of being part of our family. You must see the difference so clearly. The world of serving others, Reginald added, and the world of being served. You've experienced both sides of the equation, which gives you a unique perspective. They were asking me to become complicit in their cruelty, to join their club by stepping on the people I'd supposedly once been. They wanted me to look down on David, to dismiss the service staff, to embrace the very attitudes that had been directed at me my entire marriage. I do see things differently now, I said carefully, my hands resting calmly on the white linen tablecloth while my mind raced with possibilities. I knew you would, Vivian said with satisfaction. It's amazing how perspective changes when you're on the other side of things, isn't it? David returned with the lemon, his professional mask firmly back in place, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he avoided eye contact with anyone except me. When he set the small dish beside Cordelia's caviar, she didn't even acknowledge him. That will be all for now. Reginald dismissed him with a wave. As David walked away, Cordelia turned back to me with bright malicious interest. Now then, Isabella, tell us honestly, doesn't it feel wonderful to finally be on this side of things? To be the one being served instead of the one serving? The question hung in the air like a challenge, like a test of loyalty, like a final invitation to join their exclusive club of casual cruelty. And that's when I realized that their treatment of me hadn't been getting worse throughout our marriage. I'd just been getting better at seeing it for what it really was. They didn't want me to fit in. They wanted me to know my place. The problem was, they had no idea what my place actually was. The breaking point came not with a dramatic outburst or a moment of explosive anger, but with something far more devastating: absolute clarity. As I sat there, watching my husband's family treat both the restaurant staff and me like elaborate entertainment. I felt something fundamental shift inside me, a quiet, irreversible decision that would change everything. The moment crystallized when our main courses arrived. David approached our table carrying a heavy tray, accompanied by another server, Maria, who I recognized as one of the newer staff members. Together they began the careful choreography of fine dining service, presenting each dish with the precision and artistry that made Belmont's reputation legendary throughout Silverbrook. The herb-crusted lamb with rosemary reduction for Miss Ashworth, David announced quietly, placing the elegant plate before Vivian with practiced grace. She didn't acknowledge him, didn't even look up. Instead, she immediately cut into the meat, chewed thoughtfully, and then sighed with theatrical disappointment. "It's overcooked," she declared loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear. "I specifically requested medium rare, and this is clearly closer to medium." I looked at the lamb. It was perfect, the exact shade of pink that any decent chef would call a flawless medium rare. But Vivienne wasn't interested in accuracy. She was interested in performance, in demonstrating her power over people she considered beneath her. David's face remained carefully neutral. "I apologize, ma'am. Would you like me to have the kitchen prepare another?" "Well, of course you should," she snapped. "Though at this point our entire meal will be ruined by the delay. Really, the standards here have declined significantly." Maria, who couldn't have been more than 22, looked genuinely distressed. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Ashworth. I can speak with the chef immediately about." "Don't bother," Vivian cut her off with a dismissive wave. "I'll make do with what I have, though I certainly won't be paying full price for substandard food." The lamb was not substandard. If anything, it was exceptional, perfectly cooked, beautifully presented, exactly what anyone with genuine culinary knowledge would expect from a restaurant of Belmont's caliber. But Vivian wasn't operating in reality. She was operating in a world where her dissatisfaction was a tool of control. Reginald received his duck breast with equal disdain. "The sauce is too thick," he complained before even tasting it. "And the presentation is sloppy. See how the microgreens are wilted? That's carelessness." The microgreens were pristine, arranged with the kind of artistic precision that came from years of training. But Reginald, like his wife, wasn't interested in truth. He was interested in superiority. Cordelia picked at her seafood risotto with the air of someone being forced to eat peasant food. "The rice is too al dente," she announced. "And there's not nearly enough lobster. For what we're paying, I'd expect much more generous portion." The risotto was perfect. The rice cooked to exactly the texture that any Italian chef would approve of, and the lobster portion was exactly what the menu specified. But accuracy wasn't the point. Degradation. I watched this performance with growing amazement, not at their cruelty, but at their complete inability to recognize it. They genuinely believed they were discerning customers providing valuable feedback when in reality they were simply bullying people who couldn't fight back. "Isabella," Vivian said suddenly, turning to me with that bright, predatory smile, "you're not eating. Is something wrong with your dish?" My plate held the signature Belmont's creation: pan-seared halibut with saffron beurre blanc, roasted vegetables and a delicate herb oil that caught the light like liquid emeralds. It was, without question, one of the most beautiful and expertly prepared dishes I'd seen in months. "It's perfect," I said quietly. "Perfect." Cordelia laughed. "Really? Even with the obvious flaws in presentation?" I looked at my plate again, then at her. "What flaws?" "Well, obviously the sauce is too thin, the vegetables are undercooked, and the fish itself looks dry around the edge." None of that was true. The dish was flawless, a testament to the skill of the chef and the attention to detail that made Belmont's exceptional. But Cordelia wasn't seeing the food. She was seeing an opportunity to test my loyalty, to see if I would join their campaign of casual cruelty. "I disagree," I said simply. The table went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of people enjoying their meal, but the tense silence of a challenge being issued and recognized. "You disagree?" Vivian repeated, her voice carrying a note of warning. "The food is exceptional," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "The lamb is cooked perfectly, the duck is beautifully prepared, the risotto is exactly as it should be, and my halibut is flawless. There's nothing wrong with any of it." Reginald set down his fork with deliberate precision. "Isabella," I think your coefficient with truly fine dining might be showing. These are subtle distinctions that require a trained palate to appreciate. A trained palate, I repeated, and for the first time all evening, not the careful diplomatic smile I'd worn for 2 years of family dinners, but something else entirely, something that carried the weight of truth. Marcus looked at me with growing alarm. He knew that smile, though he'd rarely seen it directed at his family. Isabella, maybe we should. Should what? I asked, turning to face my husband directly. Should I agree that exceptional food is substandard? Should I join in treating the staff like they're incompetent when they're clearly skilled professionals? Should I pretend that what I'm witnessing is normal, acceptable behavior? The question hung in the air like a bomb with a lit fuse. You're being emotional, Vivian said with practiced condescension. It's understandable given your background, but this is simply how discerning customers express their standards. Discerning customers, I repeated slowly, savoring each word. Is that what we're calling this? David appeared at our table again, his professionalism intact despite the ongoing assault on his competence. Is everything satisfactory with your meal? The question was directed to the table as a whole, but his eyes flickered to me for just a moment, a brief look that said he'd overheard enough to understand what was happening. Actually, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the dining room, everything is outstanding. The food is exceptional. The service is impeccable, and the entire experience has been exactly what anyone should expect from a restaurant of this caliber. I turned to look at each member of Marcus's family in turn. The only thing that's been substandard tonight is the behavior at this table. The silence that followed was deafening. Other diners were beginning to notice our table, drawn by the tension that was now impossible to ignore. Vivian's face had gone pale, then flushed with anger. How dare you? How dare I interrupted, and my voice carried a new quality, not louder but somehow more substantial, more present. How dare I refuse to participate in your little performance? How dare I decline to join you in treating decent, hard-working people like they're beneath us? I stood up slowly, my napkin falling to the floor like a dropped gauntlet. You want to know what my experience in restaurants taught me? It taught me the difference between people who understand hospitality and people who use their money as an excuse for cruelty. Marcus reached for my hand. Isabella, please, you're making a scene. No, I said, pulling my hand away. They made the scene. I'm just refusing to pretend it's normal anymore. I looked down at the table, at these people who had spent 2 years making me feel small, making me question my worth, making me believe that their acceptance was something I should be grateful for. You want to know what's really substandard? I asked, my voice carrying across the suddenly quiet dining room. It's sitting in one of the finest restaurants in the city and being unable to appreciate excellence because you're too busy proving your superiority to people who already know their worth. And with that I walked away from the table, leaving behind, not just a family dinner but 2 years of carefully maintained silence in the face of casual cruelty. I was done being quiet. I was done being grateful. I was done pretending that their acceptance mattered more than my dignity. What I wasn't done with was showing them exactly who they'd been underestimating all this time. I made it exactly 3 steps away from the table before my phone buzzed against my hip with the distinctive vibration pattern I'd programmed for urgent business call. Under normal circumstances I would have ignored it. Nothing was more important than maintaining the careful facade I'd built around the Ashworth family dinners. But these weren't normal circumstances anymore, and I was no longer interested in maintaining facade. I pulled out my phone and glanced at the screen. The name that appeared made my blood run cold. Chef Antoine Dubois, urgent. Antoine was not just Belmont's head chef. He was the culinary genius I'd personally recruited from Le Bernardin 3 years ago, offering him complete creative control and a salary that had made headlines in culinary circles. He was also someone who knew better than to contact me during family dinners unless something catastrophic was happening. Behind me I could hear the Ashworth family's voices rising in agitated whispers. Marcus was undoubtedly trying to explain my behavior while his mother and sister dissected my emotional outburst with the same precision they'd applied to criticizing their perfect meals. I answered the call, stepping toward the restaurant's elegant bar area where I could speak without being overheard. Antoine, what's wrong? His accented voice carried genuine distress. Isabella, I am so sorry to disturb you, but we have a situation. The health inspector arrived unannounced 20 minutes ago and he's asking very specific questions about our ownership structure and business licenses. My stomach dropped. Unannounced health inspections weren't unusual, but ones that focused on ownership paperwork typically meant someone had filed a complaint or raised questions about the restaurant's legitimacy. What kind of question? He wants to verify that the person listed as owner on our business license is actually present and available for interview. He says there's been a complaint filed suggesting that our ownership information might be fraudulent. I closed my eyes, immediately understanding what was happening. Someone called in a complaint about me. Specifically, he hasn't said your name, but he's asking to speak with Moreau and wants to verify that this person actually exists and is actively involved in restaurant operation. He says if he can't speak with the owner tonight, he'll have to begin proceedings to suspend our operating license pending investigation. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Someone had orchestrated this, and I had a sinking suspicion about who. Where is he now? In my office reviewing our documentation. But Isabella, he's becoming impatient. He says he needs to speak with you within the next 15 minutes or he'll begin shutdown procedures. I glanced back toward the Ashworth table where the conversation had grown more animated. Marcus was gesturing emphatically while his mother sat with her arms crossed, her face a mask of righteous indignation. They thought they were dealing with a wayward daughter-in-law having an emotional breakdown. They had no idea they were about to witness the complete destruction of their worldview. I'll be right there, I told Antoine. And Antoine, prepare the full ownership documentation. All of it. Everything. Even the property deeds and the acquisition papers. Everything. I hung up and walked back toward the table, my mind racing through the implications. If someone had filed a complaint about the restaurant's ownership, it could only be because they suspected something about my identity. And if they suspected something, it meant my carefully maintained anonymity was about to be shattered in the most public way possible. As I approached the table, Marcus looked up with relief. Isabella, thank God. Please just sit down and we can work through this. I need to step away for a few minutes, I said calmly. There's an urgent business matter that requires my immediate attention. Vivian scoffed. Business? What possible business could you have that's more important than resolving this family situation? The irony of her question was so perfect it almost made me laugh. Restaurant business, I said simply. Restaurant business, Cordelia repeated with mock concern. Isabella, surely whatever problems your former colleagues are having can wait until after dinner. You're not responsible for every service industry crisis in the city. Former colleagues, I repeated slowly, savoring the phrase. You're right, Cordelia. I'm not responsible for every service industry crisis in the city. I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle in my mind before speaking them aloud. Just this one. Before anyone could respond, I turned and walked toward the back of the restaurant, toward the administrative offices that the Ashworth family had never seen, never questioned, never even thought to ask about. Behind me, I could hear Marcus calling my name, but I didn't turn around. The narrow hallway that led to the restaurant's business offices was familiar territory. I'd walked it hundreds of times over the past 4 years. Usually during off hours when the dining room was empty and I could review operations without drawing attention. Tonight, however, I was walking it while the restaurant was full, while my husband's family sat in the dining room making complaints about food they couldn't properly appreciate, while a health inspector waited to verify my identity. I knocked on Antoine's office door and entered without waiting for permission. The health inspector was a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a clipboard that looked like it had seen better days. He looked up when I entered, his expression skeptical. Mr. Moreau, I presume. Miss Moreau, I corrected. Isabella Moreau. You wanted to speak with me. He consulted his paperwork. According to the complaint we received, there are questions about whether Moreau actually exists as an active owner of this establishment, or whether the ownership information is being used to hide the restaurant's true financial backing. What kind of complaint? He adjusted his glasses. An anonymous tip suggesting that this restaurant is actually owned by organized crime figures using fake identities to launder money. and that the person listed as owner is either fictitious or a front for illegal operation. The accusation was so absurd, so transparently vindictive, that I almost admired its audacity. Someone had decided that if I claimed to have restaurant experience, they would use that claim to destroy me in the most public and humiliating way possible. I can assure you that I am very real and very much the legitimate owner of Belmont's, I said calmly. What documentation do you need to verify this? I'll need to see photo identification, business licenses, property deeds, tax records, and evidence of your active involvement in restaurant operations. Antoine had already prepared everything, spreading the documents across his desk like a legal brief. The health inspector began reviewing them, methodically, his skepticism gradually giving way to confusion, then surprise, then something approaching awe. These property deeds show that you personally own not just the restaurant business, but the entire building, he said slowly. That's correct. And these tax records indicate annual revenue in the... He paused, consulting the numbers again. 8-figure range. Also correct. He looked up at me, then back at the paperwork, then at Antoine, who was watching the proceedings with barely concealed pride. Ms. Moreau, I have to ask, do you have any idea who might have filed this complaint? Because these accusations are not just unfounded, they're almost deliberately false. Anyone with access to public business records could have verified your ownership status. I thought about the Ashworth family sitting in the dining room, probably still discussing my emotional instability and wondering when I would return to apologize for my outburst. I thought about their casual cruelty toward the staff, their assumption that I should be grateful for their acceptance, their complete inability to imagine that the person they'd been dismissing might actually matter. I have a few ideas, but right now I'm more interested in ensuring that you're satisfied with our compliance. He nodded, gathering the documents. More than satisfied. I'll be filing a report indicating that the complaint was completely without merit, and that Belmont's is operating under full legitimate ownership with all proper documentation. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door. Ms. Moreau, I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I've never seen more thorough business documentation or a more professionally run establishment. Whoever filed that complaint clearly had no idea what they were dealing with. After he left, Antoine and I stood in his office, the weight of what had just happened settling around us like dust after an explosion. They tried to destroy you, he said quietly. Whoever called that in. They were trying to have us shut down, to humiliate you publicly. Yes, I agree. They were. What do you want to do? I thought about that question, really considered it. For 2 years I had absorbed their insults, accepted their condescension, allowed them to treat me like a charity case they'd graciously decided to tolerate. I had been patient, diplomatic, understanding. I was done being understanding. I want to go back to dinner, I said finally. I think it's time my husband's family learned exactly who they've been dining with. When I returned to the dining room, the atmosphere at our table had shifted dramatically. What I found was a scene of barely controlled chaos masquerading as civilized conversation. Marcus was pacing beside his chair while his mother spoke in urgent hushed tones into her phone. Cordelia sat with her arms crossed, wearing the satisfied expression of someone who believed they'd just won a particularly decisive battle. The other diners in the restaurant had begun to take note. Our table had become a source of whispered speculation and sideways glances, the kind of attention that the Ashworth family normally craved, but clearly found uncomfortable under these circumstances. As I approached, Vivienne ended her phone call and looked up at me with a smile that could have cut glass. It was the expression of a woman who believed she held all the cards and was about to play a winning hand. Isabella, darling, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. We were just discussing your little outburst. We understand that you've been under stress lately, and we want you to know that we're willing to overlook this unfortunate incident. I pulled out my chair and sat down slowly, my movements deliberate and controlled. How generous of you. We are generous, Cordelia interjected, her eyes bright with malicious glee. Especially considering the phone call Mother just made. Marcus stopped pacing and turned to face his sister. Cordelia, that's enough. No, I think Isabella deserves to know, Vivienne said, setting her phone down on the table like a weapon. You see, dear, When you mentioned having urgent restaurant business to attend to, it got us thinking. About your past, about the stories you've told us, about certain inconsistencies in your background. The air at our table grew thick with tension. I could see David hovering nearby, clearly wanting to check on our table but uncertain whether he should interrupt what was obviously a family crisis. Inconsistencies, I repeated calmly. Yes, Reginald said, leaning forward with the predatory intensity of a man who smelled blood in the water. You see, Isabella, we've always been curious about your actual work history. Your stories about the restaurant industry have been remarkably vague, and tonight, when you claimed to have urgent business matters to attend to, we decided to do some investigating, Vivian finished triumphantly. I just spoke with the health department. They confirmed that someone did indeed file a complaint about this very restaurant tonight, citing concerns about fraudulent ownership and possible criminal activity. The revelation hung in the air like a challenge. Around us, the soft murmur of dinner conversation continued, but I could feel the attention of nearby tables drawn to our increasingly dramatic exchange. You filed a complaint against Belmont's, I said, and it wasn't a question. We felt it was our civic duty, Cordelia said with exaggerated righteousness. If you're involved with questionable business practices, if you've been lying to our family about your background, we needed to know. Marcus looked genuinely stricken. You called the health department on Isabella. We called the health department on a potentially fraudulent business operation, his mother corrected sharply. The fact that Isabella claimed to have urgent business here tonight, combined with her suspicious knowledge of restaurant operations, and her emotional reaction to criticism of the service, suggested that she might be more involved with this establishment than she's admitted. The logic was twisted but not entirely without merit. They had noticed things. My defense of the food quality, my familiarity with service standards, my immediate response to criticism of the staff. Their mistake wasn't in noticing these things. It was in assuming they indicated criminal activity, rather than legitimate ownership. So you tried to have the restaurant shut down, I said, my voice remaining perfectly level despite the fury building in my chest. We tried to uncover the truth, Reginald said defensively. If there's nothing to hide, then a health department investigation shouldn't be a problem. And if there is something to hide, Vivian added with satisfaction, then our family has a right to know what kind of person Marcus has married. The assumption was breathtaking in its arrogance. They had decided that my behavior tonight, defending excellent food and professional service, was evidence of criminal activity. Rather than questioning their own conduct, they had chosen to attack mine in the most destructive way possible. The health inspector was here for about 30 minutes, I said, conversationally. Did your contact at the health department mention how the investigation concluded? Vivian's smile flickered slightly. The investigation is ongoing. These things take time. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone and scrolling to a recent message. The investigation concluded about 15 minutes ago. The inspector filed his report before he left. I held up the phone, showing them the email I'd received from the health department's automated system, confirming the closure of their complaint. It seems your allegations of fraudulent ownership and criminal activity were found to be completely without merit. I continued. In fact, the inspector noted that he'd never seen more thorough business documentation or a more professionally run establishment. The color began to drain from Vivian's face, but she wasn't ready to concede defeat. That doesn't explain why you were so defensive about the service here, or why you claim to have urgent business, Mrs. Ashworth. The voice came from behind me, calm and respectful but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. We all turned to see Antoine approaching our table, still wearing his chef's coat and carrying a leather portfolio. His presence immediately drew the attention of other diners. Chef Antoine Dubois was something of a celebrity in Silverbrook's culinary scene, and his approach to our table was generating considerable interest. Chef Dubois, Vivian said, her voice uncertain for the first time all evening. Is there a problem? Not at all, Antoine replied politely. I simply wanted to personally ensure that Ms. Moreau's family was enjoying their meal this evening. The way he said Ms. Moreau's family carried a weight that made everyone at the table sit up straight. It wasn't the tone of a chef speaking to random customers. It was the tone of an employee speaking about his employer's relatives. Ms. Moreau? Marcus repeated slowly, his eyes moving between Antoine and me. Isabella Moreau? Antoine clarified, opening his portfolio and withdrawing a single sheet of paper. I have here a copy of tonight's health department report, which I thought you might be interested in reviewing. He placed the document on the table where everyone could see it. The letterhead was official, the language formal, but the content was unmistakable. A complete vindication of Belmont's business practices and ownership structure. As you can see, Antoine continued, the inspector found our documentation to be exemplary. All business licenses current, all ownership information accurate and properly filed, all financial records transparent and legitimate. Cordelia leaned forward to read the report, her face growing increasingly pale. This says the owner is Isabella Moreau of Silverbrook. That's correct, Antoine confirmed. Ms. Moreau has owned Belmont's for 4 years. She also owns the building, the property, and 3 other restaurants in the metro area. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the exact moment when the implications hit each member of the Ashworth family, the dawning realization that their assumptions about me had been not just wrong but spectacularly, catastrophically incorrect. Isabella, Marcus said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. You own Belmont's. I own Belmont's. I confirmed. You own this restaurant, Reginald said, as if repeating the fact might make it less true. This restaurant, this building, and as Antoine mentioned, 3 others in the area. Vivienne looked like she was having trouble processing the information. But you work in restaurants. I do work in restaurants. I agreed. I work in the ones I own. The revelation rippled outward from our table like a stone dropped in still water. Other diners were beginning to turn and stare openly now, drawn by the obvious drama playing out in their midst. Antoine cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps this conversation would be more comfortable in one of our private dining rooms. No, I said firmly, my voice carrying clearly across the now quiet restaurant. I think this conversation is exactly where it needs to be. Because after 2 years of being treated like a charity case, after months of subtle insults and condescending remarks, after tonight's attempt to destroy my business and reputation, I was done hiding. It was time for the Ashworth family to learn exactly who they'd been dealing with all along. The silence stretched across our table like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. I could see the wheels turning in each of their minds, trying to reconcile the woman they'd dismissed as a former waitress with the reality of someone who owned the very establishment where they'd been performing their monthly ritual of superiority. Antoine remained standing beside our table, his presence serving as both confirmation of my identity and a silent witness to what was about to unfold. Other diners had stopped even pretending to focus on their own meals. Our table had become the evening's entertainment, though not in the way the Ashworth family typically preferred. 4 years, Marcus said finally, his voice hollow. You've owned this place for 4 years and you never told me? I told you I worked in restaurant management, I replied calmly. You chose to interpret that as serving table. Restaurant management and restaurant ownership are completely different things, Cordelia protested, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. Are they? I asked. Because from where I sit, they look remarkably similar. Both involve understanding every aspect of the operation, ensuring quality control, managing staff, maintaining relationships with suppliers, overseeing financial performance. I paused, letting that sink in before continuing. The only real difference is who signs the check. Vivienne had been uncharacteristically quiet, but now she leaned forward with desperate intensity. Even if you do own this restaurant, that doesn't excuse your behavior tonight. Your outburst was completely inappropriate. My outburst, I interrupted, and for the first time I allowed real steel to enter my voice. Let me make sure I understand what you're calling inappropriate. Was it inappropriate when I defended the quality of food that you falsely criticized? Was it inappropriate when I refused to join you in treating the staff like they were incompetent? Or was it inappropriate when I declined to participate in your little performance of superiority? Antoine shifted slightly, and I caught his eye. Antoine, would you mind sharing with my family your professional assessment of tonight's service and food quality? Certainly, he replied, his accent lending gravity to his words. Tonight's service has been flawless. The staff has performed at the highest professional standards. The food has been prepared exactly to specification, and every dish that left my kitchen met the exacting standards that have earned Belmont's its reputation. He turned to address Vivienne directly. "Madam, the lamb you complained about being overcooked was precisely medium rare, cooked to an internal temperature of 130 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the industry standard. The duck was prepared using a classical French technique that I learned working under Daniel Boulud, and the risotto was made with carnaroli rice imported directly from Piedmont." Reginald cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, taste is subjective. Taste is subjective," Antoine agreed. "But cooking techniques, temperature measurements, and professional standards are not. Your family spent the evening criticizing food that was objectively perfect and service that was demonstrably professional." The words hit like physical blows. Around us I could hear the soft murmur of other diners discussing what they were witnessing. The Ashworth family's reputation for sophisticated dining was crumbling in real time, in front of an audience of Silverbrook's social and business elite. "Furthermore," I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the dining room, "since we're discussing inappropriate behavior, let's talk about filing false complaints with the health department. Let's discuss trying to have a legitimate business shut down based on nothing more than spite and assumption." Vivienne's face had gone ashen. "We didn't know. You didn't want to know," I corrected. "There's a difference. For 2 years you've made assumptions about who I am based on nothing more than your own prejudices. You decided I was beneath you, and you treated me accordingly." I reached into my purse and withdrew a business card case, removing several cards and placing them on the table like evidence in a trial. "Isabella Moreau, CEO and founder, Moreau Hospitality Group," I said, placing the first card in front of Mark. "We own Belmont's Riverside Bistro, the Garden Terrace and Copper and Oak. Annual revenue last year was $47 million. I placed the second card in front of Vivienne. "Isabella Moreau, board member, Silverbrook Culinary Institute." I endowed the scholarship program that provides full tuition for underprivileged students pursuing careers in hospitality. The third card went to Reginald. "Isabella Moreau, founding member, Silverbrook Restaurant Alliance. We work with city planning to support local food businesses and ensure fair labor practices throughout the industry." The final card I placed in front of Cordelia. "Isabella Moreau, silent partner, Downtown Development Initiative. I've invested over $12 million in neighborhood revitalization projects, including the affordable housing complex 3 blocks from here." Each card landed on the white tablecloth like a small explosion, destroying another layer of their carefully constructed assumptions about who I was and what I was worth. "The woman you've been treating like a charity case," I continued, "has been quietly funding half the community development projects in this city. The former waitress you've been condescending to has been anonymously supporting causes that actually matter, while you've been hosting galas that exist primarily to get your pictures in society magazines." Marcus looked physically ill. "Isabella, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted to see who you were when you thought I needed you," I replied simply. "I wanted to understand what kind of family I was marrying into, what kind of people my husband had grown up with." I gestured around the dining room, which had fallen almost completely silent as other diners strained to hear our conversation. "And now I know." Antoine stepped forward again. "If I may," he said diplomatically, "Ms. Moreau has been the most hands-on owner I've ever worked with. She knows every member of our staff by name, she's personally involved in menu development, and she's implemented the most comprehensive employee benefits package in the city's restaurant industry." "Employee benefits," Vivienne repeated weakly. "Health insurance, dental coverage, paid vacation, retirement contributions, and profit-sharing bonuses," I confirmed, "because the people who work in my restaurants aren't just help, they're professionals who deserve respect and fair compensation." I looked around the table at these people who had spent 2 years making me feel small, who had just tonight tried to destroy my reputation and business, who had treated both me and my staff like we existed solely for their convenience and entertainment. "David, the server you've been dismissing all evening, is working his way through a master's program in hospitality management. Maria, whom you barely acknowledged, speaks 4 languages and is one of our most knowledgeable wine stewards. The incompetent kitchen staff you complained about includes graduates from the Culinary Institute of America and Johnson & Wales. I paused, letting that information settle over them like a heavy blanket. Every person you've treated as invisible tonight is a skilled professional who could work at any restaurant in this city. They work here because I've created an environment where they're valued, respected, and fairly compensated. The contrast was devastating and obvious. While the Ashworth family had spent the evening demonstrating their sense of entitlement and superiority, I had been running a business that actually treated people with dignity. So when you ask why I never told you the full scope of what I do, I said, standing up slowly and looking down at each of them in turn, it's because I wanted to see if you could respect someone you thought had less than you. And the answer is that you can't. I picked up my business cards from the table, sliding them back into their case with deliberate precision. The woman you've been calling emotional and inappropriate has built something real, something that matters, something that provides livelihoods for 67 employees and contributes meaningfully to this community. I looked directly at Vivienne, whose carefully applied makeup could no longer hide the shock and humiliation written across her face. The question now, I said quietly, is what you're going to do with that information. The shift in the room's atmosphere was palpable, like the moment when a storm breaks and the air pressure changes so dramatically that you can feel it in your bones. What had been the Ashworth family's domain, their regular table at their preferred restaurant where they held court once a month, had suddenly become something else entirely. It had become my boardroom, and I was no longer the supplicant, seeking their approval. I remained standing, looking down at these people who had spent 2 years teaching me exactly what they thought of those they considered beneath them. The dining room around us had grown so quiet that the soft clink of silverware from distant tables sounded like crystal chimes in a cathedral. Marcus was the first to attempt damage control, his voice carrying the desperate tone of someone who suddenly realized the ground beneath his feet had completely disappeared. Isabella, I had no idea. If you had just told me the extent of your business holdings, the extent of my business holdings, I repeated, and there was something almost gentle in my voice that made everyone at the table freeze. Marcus, do you hear yourself right now? I leaned forward slightly, placing my hands on the back of my chair. You're suggesting that the problem here is that I didn't adequately advertise my net worth to your family, that if I had simply been more forthcoming about my financial success, this evening would have gone different. Reginald cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of authority. Isabella, we may have misunderstood your position, but that doesn't excuse. Stop. The single word cut through his attempted justification like a blade. Just stop talking for a moment, and listen to what you're saying. I straightened up and something in my posture must have changed, because even Antoine took a small step back. This wasn't the diplomatic woman who had been managing family tensions for 2 years. This was the CEO who had built a multi-million-dollar business from nothing, who had negotiated with city planners and investors, who had earned the respect of an entire industry through competence and integrity. You're trying to excuse 2 years of condescension, dismissal and outright cruelty by suggesting that I should have provided you with my financial statements up front, I continued. You're arguing that your behavior tonight, filing false complaints with the health department, attempting to destroy my business, treating my staff like servants would have been different if you had known I was wealthy. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Around us I could see other diners leaning in, no longer even pretending to focus on their own meals. The Ashworth family's public humiliation was becoming the social event of the season, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. And the truly devastating part, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent restaurant, is that you're probably right. Vivienne flinched as if I'd slapped her. If I had introduced myself 2 years ago as the owner of Moreau Hospitality Group, you would have treated me different. If Marcus had brought home a successful businesswoman instead of someone you assumed was working class, your behavior would have been entirely different. I walked slowly around the table and it felt like a predator circling prey. But here's what you still don't understand, that makes you worse, not better. I stopped behind Cordelia's chair. You don't treat people with respect because they've earned it through wealth or status. You treat people with respect because they're human beings, deserving of basic dignity. Cordelia tried to turn around to face me, but I had already moved on, stopping behind Reginald's chair. Every server you've dismissed, every worker you've looked through, like they were invisible. Every person you've treated as less than human. They all have stories, dreams, families, struggles and successes that matter just as much as yours. I moved to stand behind Vivienne, whose carefully styled hair couldn't hide the fact that her hands were trembling. The difference between us isn't that I'm wealthy and they're not. The difference is that I understand that a person's worth isn't determined by their bank account, their job title, or their family name. I completed the circuit back to my own chair but didn't sit down. Instead, I gestured toward David, who had been watching our table with growing amazement. "David, would you please join us for a moment?" He approached hesitantly, clearly uncertain about being drawn into what was obviously a family crisis. "David," I said, "I'd like you to meet my husband's family. This is Marcus. His parents, Reginald and Vivian Ashworth, and his sister Cordelia." David nodded politely, though I could see the confusion in his eyes. "David is pursuing his master's degree in hospitality management," I continued, addressing the table. "He works here 3 nights a week to help pay for his education. He's also a volunteer firefighter in his hometown and helps coach Little League baseball on weekends." The Ashworth family sat frozen, unable to respond to this sudden humanization of someone they'd spent the evening treating as background scenery. "David," I said, turning to him with genuine warmth, "these are the people who filed a complaint with the health department tonight, claiming that this restaurant was involved in fraudulent business practices." His eyes widened. "The health inspection tonight was because of a complaint." "Anonymous tip," I confirmed. "Someone suggested that our ownership information was fraudulent and that we might be a front for criminal activity." David looked at the Ashworth family with new understanding, and I could see the exact moment when he connected their behavior throughout the evening with their attempt to destroy the restaurant that employed him. "I see," he said quietly, and those 2 words carried more judgment than any lengthy condemnation could have achieved. Antoine stepped forward again. "David, would you please ask Maria to join us as well, and Chef Williams, if he's available?" Within moments, our table was surrounded by restaurant staff, not as servers attending to demanding customers, but as professionals standing with their employer. The visual was powerful. The Ashworth family sitting trapped at their table, encircled by the very people they had spent the evening dismissing and disrespecting. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, addressing my staff, "I want you to meet the family that tried to have our restaurant shut down tonight. They filed a false complaint with the health department, claiming we were operating illegally." The staff exchanged glances, and I could see anger beginning to build in their faces. These were people whose livelihoods had been threatened by the Ashworths' vindictive action. Maria spoke first, her voice carefully controlled. "They tried to get us shut down." "They did," I confirmed, "because they disapproved of my behavior when I defended the quality of your work and refused to join them in criticizing your professionalism." Chef Williams, a mountain of a man who rarely spoke but commanded absolute respect in the kitchen, stepped forward. "Ma'am, are you saying these people tried to destroy our jobs because you wouldn't let them insult us?" "That's exactly what I'm saying." The shift was complete. What had begun as the Ashworth family's comfortable monthly assertion of superiority had become a public trial where they sat as defendants facing a jury of their victim. They were no longer the powerful patrons being served by grateful staff. They were the exposed bullies being confronted by the community they had tried to harm. And I was no longer the grateful daughter-in-law seeking their acceptance. I was the person holding their fate in my hands, with the power to decide how this evening would end and what consequences they would face for their action. The reversal was so complete, so total that even the other diners in the restaurant seemed to understand that they were witnessing something historic. The moment when old money met new reality, and new reality won decisive. The weight of the moment settled over our gathering like a heavy curtain, and I could see in the Ashworth family's faces the dawning realization that their actions would have consequences far beyond a ruined dinner. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't just about hurt feelings or family drama. This was about real damage they had attempted to inflict on real people's lives. I looked around at my staff, these professionals who had been treated like props in the Ashworth family's monthly performance of superiority, and made a decision that had been building in my mind since the moment I learned about their complaint to the health department. "Antoine," I said, my voice carrying the authority that came with 4 years of building something meaningful, "I want you to prepare a comprehensive report of tonight's event. Include the false health department complaint, the harassment of our staff, and the attempt to damage our restaurant's reputation." Antoine nodded grimly, for our legal team, for our legal team, for the Restaurant Alliance and for the Better Business Bureau. I want a complete record of what happened here tonight. Vivian's face went white. Isabella, surely you don't intend to. To what? I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to cut crystal. To hold you accountable for filing false complaints against a legitimate business. To document your attempt to destroy the livelihoods of innocent workers. To ensure that other restaurants are warned about customers who abuse complaint systems for personal vendettas. I pulled out my phone and began scrolling through my contacts. You see, when you own multiple businesses in a small community, you develop certain relationships, professional relationships built on mutual respect and shared interests. I tapped on a name and hit dial, putting the phone on speaker so everyone could hear. The call was answered on the second ring. Isabella, how are you, darling? The voice belonged to Catherine Westfield, the food critic for the Silverbrook Herald and one of the most influential voices in the city's dining scene. Hello, Kath. I'm calling from Belmont's, where we've just had a rather extraordinary evening. I was wondering if you might be interested in a story about customers who abuse health department complaint systems to harass restaurant staff. The silence from our table was deafening. Catherine's interest, however, was immediate and audible. Oh my, that sounds fascinating. Are we talking about false complaints? Because that's been a growing problem in the industry. We are indeed. False complaints filed in retaliation for refusing to participate in the mistreatment of service staff. I have documentation, witness statements and the health department's report clearing us of all allegations. Isabella, this could be a very important story. The public needs to understand how these kinds of vindictive actions affect small businesses and working people. I looked directly at Vivian. As I responded, that's exactly what I was thinking. I'll have my team send you everything by tomorrow morning. After ending the call, I immediately dialed another number. This time, the voice that answered was crisp and professional. Rodriguez and Associates, Legal Services. Maria, it's Isabella Moreau. I need to discuss filing complaints against individuals who submitted false reports to city agencies about my business operations. Marcus finally found his voice. Isabella, please. This is getting out of hand. We can work this out privately. Privately. I turned to face him with an expression that must have been colder than I realized, because he actually leaned back in his chair. Like how you privately filed complaints against my business. Like how you privately attempted to destroy my reputation. I returned my attention to the phone call. Maria, I'm particularly interested in the legal ramifications for individuals who knowingly file false complaints with regulatory agencies. Yes, I'll hold. While waiting for the lawyer to return to the line, I looked around at my staff who were watching the proceedings with a mixture of satisfaction and amazement. David, I want you to know that anyone who attempted to cost you your job will face the full legal consequences of their actions, I said clearly. No one should have to worry about vindictive customers destroying their livelihood because they didn't like being held accountable for their behavior. Thank you, Miss Moreau, David replied, and his voice carried genuine gratitude. I was worried when I heard about the health department visit. You'll never have to worry about that again, I assured him. Not as long as you work for me. Maria Rodriguez came back on the line. Isabella, filing false reports with city agencies is actually a misdemeanor offense in this jurisdiction. If you have evidence that the complaints were knowingly false and filed with malicious intent, we can definitely pursue both criminal and civil remedies. Excellent. I'll have everything to you by tomorrow. The call ended, and the silence that followed was profound. The Ashworth family sat frozen, apparently only now beginning to understand the full scope of what they had set in motion. But I wasn't finished. I pulled up another contact and dialed without hesitation. This call was answered by a recorded message, but the organization's name was enough to make Reginald visibly flinch. You've reached the Silverbrook Chamber of Commerce. If this is an emergency business matter, please press 1. I pressed 1. A live voice answered. Chamber emergency line. This is James. James. This is Isabella Moreau from Moreau Hospitality Group. I need to report a serious incident involving the abuse of city regulatory systems by individuals attempting to damage local businesses. Moreau, we take these matters very seriously. What kind of incident are we talking about? false health department complaints filed as retaliation against a restaurant that refused to tolerate customer harassment of staff members. That's exactly the kind of predatory behavior we've been working to combat. Can you email us the details? Absolutely. I'll include the health department's report, witness statements, and documentation of the false claim. After that call ended, I made one final call, this one to someone whose response would matter most to the Ashworth family. Silverbrook Country Club, Member Services. This is Isabella Moreau. I'd like to speak with someone about the club's policies regarding members who engage in harassment of local business owners. Vivian actually gasped. The country club wasn't just a recreational facility for the Ashworth family. It was the center of their social universe, the place where their status and reputation were most important. Ms. Moreau, I'll connect you with our member relations director immediately. As I waited for the transfer, I looked around the table at these people who had tried to destroy my business, my reputation, and my employees' livelihoods, because I had refused to join them in their casual cruelty. You see, I said quietly, when you try to destroy someone's life, you should probably make sure they don't have the resources and connections to fight back. The member relations director came on the line, and I could see the Ashworth family's faces growing paler with each word I spoke. Yes, I'd like to discuss a situation involving club members who have been filing false complaints against local businesses. I have documentation showing deliberate attempts to harm the reputation and operations of multiple restaurants in our community. When I finished that call, I set my phone down on the table and looked at each member of the Ashworth family in turn. So here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. You're going to face the consequences of your action. Legal consequences, professional consequences, and social consequences. I stood up, smoothing my dress with deliberate care. You taught me something important tonight about the difference between people who have power and people who deserve. I gestured toward my staff, who had remained standing throughout this entire confrontation, their faces reflecting a mixture of pride and satisfaction. These people deserve respect because they work hard, treat others with dignity, and contribute meaningfully to our community. You, on the other hand, have just demonstrated that having money and social position doesn't automatically make someone worthy of the power those things provide. The consequences were already in motion, and there was nothing they could do to stop them. In the aftermath of the phone calls that had systematically dismantled their world, the Ashworth family began to fracture along lines that had probably existed for years but had never been tested under this kind of pressure. What emerged was a clear separation between those who were capable of growth and those who were fundamentally committed to their own sense of superiority, regardless of the cost. Marcus was the first to break. I watched as he sat there, his face cycling through emotions like a man watching his entire worldview collapse in real time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Isabella, I'm sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry. The words hung in the air, and I could see in his eyes that he meant them, not because he was facing consequences, but because he was finally seeing clearly for the first time in his adult life. I let them, he continued, his voice breaking slightly. I let them treat you like you were beneath us. I let my mother dismiss you. I let Cordelia mock you. I let my father question your background, and I told myself I was keeping the peace, but really I was just taking the easy way out. He looked up at me, and there was something raw and honest in his expression that I hadn't seen in the 2 years we'd been married. You defended the staff tonight. You defended the food. You defended basic human decency, and instead of standing with you, I worried about embarrassing my family. He laughed bitterly, when the real embarrassment was sitting at this table the whole time, and it wasn't you. I studied my husband's face, looking for the calculation that usually accompanied his apologies, the subtle positioning that suggested he was more sorry about getting caught than about his actual behavior. But this time, I saw something different, genuine shame, real recognition of what he had done, and who he had chosen to be. Vivian, however, was having a very different reaction to the evening's revelations. This is completely unacceptable, she said, her voice rising with each word. Isabella, you've humiliated our family in public, you've threatened our social standing, and you've turned our staff against us with your little performance. The complete inability to accept responsibility was breathtaking. Even now, even with the evidence of their own cruelty laid out before her. Vivienne was positioning herself as the victim. Our staff, I repeated quietly. You know what I mean, she snapped. The people who work here, you've poisoned them against us with your dramatic accusation. I looked at David, Maria, Chef Williams, and Antoine, who were still standing around our table like witnesses to a historic event. Did I poison you against them? I asked David directly. He shook his head. No ma'am, they did that themselves with how they treated us tonight. And you, Maria? Did my dramatic accusations change your opinion of this family? Maria's response was diplomatic but firm. With respect, Miss Moreau, we form our opinions of customers based on how they treat us. Tonight speaks for itself. Vivienne's face flushed red. See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You've encouraged them to be insubordinate. Insubordinate, I repeated, and I could hear the dangerous edge creeping into my voice. For having opinions about how they're treated, for being human beings with thoughts and feelings rather than invisible servants. But Vivienne wasn't finished digging her own grave. These people need to understand their place, Isabella. Just because you've given them permission to speak, doesn't mean they should forget basic professional boundaries. The silence that followed was profound. Even Cordelia looked uncomfortable with her mother's words, and Reginald appeared to be trying to shrink into his chair. Basic professional boundaries, I said slowly, like not filing false complaints against your employer, like not attempting to destroy the business that pays your salary, like treating customers with respect, even when they don't deserve it. I turned to address my staff direct. I want all of you to understand something very clearly. In my restaurants, the only professional boundary that matters is treating everyone, customers, coworkers, management, with basic human dignity. Anyone who can't meet that standard, regardless of how much money they spend here, is not welcome. Antoine stepped forward. Ms. Moreau, should we prepare the check for this table? It was a simple question, but it carried enormous weight. He was asking if I was going to allow the Ashworth family to continue dining at my restaurant, if I was going to continue taking their money and subjecting my staff to their behavior. Actually, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the dining room, dinner tonight is complimentary. The unexpected generosity clearly confused the Ashworth family, but I wasn't finished. It's complimentary because this is the last meal you'll ever have here. The words hit like a physical blow. Reginald actually gasped. Isabella, Cordelia said, her voice finally showing some genuine distress. You can't ban us from Belmont's. We've been coming here for over a decade. You've been coming here for over a decade, I agreed, treating my staff like they were invisible, complaining about perfect food to demonstrate your sophistication, and generally behaving like the kind of customers that every restaurant owner dreads. I looked around the dining room, noting that every other table was openly watching our conversation now. But more importantly, you tried to destroy this business tonight. You filed false complaints with the health department. You attempted to damage our reputation and cost dozens of people their jobs because you didn't like being told that your behavior was unacceptable. I pulled out my phone and showed them the camera function. And just so we're clear, Antoine is going to take your photographs, and those pictures will be shared with every restaurant owner in the Silverbrook area. Not because I want revenge, but because my colleagues deserve to know what kind of customers you really are. You can't do that, Reginald protested. That's character assassination. No, I said calmly. Character assassination is what you attempted to do to me tonight. This is simply information sharing among business owners about customers who pose a risk to operations and staff safety. Marcus looked around the table at his family, and I could see the exact moment when he made his choice. He stood up slowly, walked around the table, and came to stand beside me. Isabella's right, he said, addressing his family directly. About all of it. The way you treated her, the way you treated the staff, the way you've behaved for years. I've been enabling it because it was easier than confronting it, but I'm done. He looked at his mother, his father, his sister. I'm ashamed of you. I'm ashamed that I let this go on for so long, and I'm ashamed that it took something this dramatic for me to finally see clearly. Vivienne stared at her son like he had just announced he was joining a cult. Marcus, she's turned you against your own family. No, he said firmly. You did that yourselves. The separation was complete. On one side stood Marcus, me, and the restaurant staff, people who had chosen growth, accountability, and basic human decency. On the other side sat Vivienne, Reginald, and Cordelia, people who remained committed to their own superiority regardless of the cost to others. It was a division that had probably been inevitable for years, but tonight had finally forced it into the open. And looking at the people who had chosen to stand with dignity rather than defend cruelty, I realized that sometimes the most important thing you can do is let people show you exactly who they are and then believe them. 3 months later, I stood in the same Venetian suite at Belmont's, but everything had changed. The room itself looked identical, same hand-painted murals, same crystal chandeliers, same view of Silverbrook's glittering skyline, but the energy was completely different. Where once there had been tension disguised as civility, now there was genuine warmth and respect. Tonight wasn't a family obligation or a monthly performance of superiority. Tonight was a celebration. "Isabella, this is incredible," said Dr. Sarah Chen, the newly appointed director of the Moreau Foundation for Hospitality Education, as she looked around the private dining room. "I still can't believe you've committed $50 million to scholarship program." I smiled, adjusting the foundation's mission statement that was displayed on an easel near the windows. "The industry gave me everything I have. It's time to make sure others have the same opportunities, regardless of their background." Marcus approached, carrying 2 glasses of champagne, and handed one to me with a smile that had become genuinely warm over the past few months. The board members from the Culinary Institute just arrived. They're amazed by the scope of the program. Our relationship had undergone a fundamental transformation since that night. The crisis had forced Marcus to examine not just his relationship with his family, but his own values and priorities. He'd started therapy, begun working with me at the restaurant group, and most importantly, had learned to recognize and challenge the entitled attitudes he'd inherited. "Mrs. Moreau." David appeared at my elbow, wearing a sharp new suit instead of his server's uniform. "The keynote speakers are ready whenever you are." David had been one of the first recipients of the Foundation's management training program. He was now working as an assistant manager at our newest location, while finishing his master's degree. His transformation from nervous server to confident hospitality professional had been remarkable to witness. "Thank you, David. How are you feeling about your presentation tonight?" "Nervous but excited," he admitted. 6 months ago, I never would have imagined speaking to a room full of industry leaders about employee dignity and workplace respect. 6 months ago, the industry wasn't ready to hear it, I replied. But things change when people finally start listening. The foundation launch had become bigger than I'd originally envisioned. What started as a scholarship program had evolved into a comprehensive initiative addressing workplace conditions, professional development, and industry standards throughout the hospitality sector. Tonight's event brought together restaurant owners, culinary school administrators, labor advocates, and government officials to announce new industry-wide standards for employee treatment. Antoine approached us, beaming with pride. "Isabella, the food writers from 3 different magazines want to interview you about how the Foundation's workplace standards are already affecting hiring practices across the city." "Later," I said. "Right now, I want to focus on the people this is really about." I looked around the room at the gathering crowd: scholarship recipients, program participants, restaurant workers who had benefited from the new workplace standards, and industry leaders who had embraced the change. This was what power should look like: not dominance over others, but the ability to lift people up and create opportunities for growth and dignity. Maria Silva, who had been promoted to head sommelier after completing our advanced training program, approached with a question about the wine service. Her confidence had blossomed over the past months as she'd been given opportunities to use her extensive knowledge and language skills in increasingly responsible roles. "Ms. Moreau, we've received requests from several tables to meet you personally. Word has spread about tonight's foundation launch, and people are excited to thank you." "Of course," I said, "but first I want to say something to all of you." I gestured to David, Maria, Chef Williams, and the other staff members who had been present that night 3 months ago. "You all witnessed something that night that no one should have to experience at work. You saw customers attempt to humiliate and diminish both me and all of you, and you handled it with more professionalism than they deserved. I paused, looking at each of them, but more importantly, that night showed me what this industry could be if we committed to treating everyone with dignity and respect. You inspired me to create something that would ensure no other worker would have to tolerate what you experienced. Chef Williams, who rarely spoke but commanded absolute respect throughout the kitchen, stepped forward. Ms. Moreau, what you've built here goes beyond one bad night. You've given all of us a voice in an industry that usually expects us to stay silent. The transformation in the restaurant's culture had been profound. Employee turnover had dropped to almost zero, productivity had increased dramatically, and most importantly, the entire staff had developed a sense of ownership and pride in their work that showed in every interaction with customers. Marcus rejoined our group and I noticed he was carrying a newspaper. Isabella, you should see this, he said, holding up the Silverbrook Herald's business section. The headline read, "Former country club members face criminal charges in false business complaint case." Below it was a smaller headline, "Ashworth family assets frozen pending civil litigation." I scanned the article quickly. The legal consequences had been even more severe than I'd anticipated. Vivienne, Reginald and Cordelia were facing both criminal charges for filing false reports and civil lawsuits from multiple businesses they had apparently targeted over the years. The investigation had revealed a pattern of vindictive complaints against service industry workers and business owners who had failed to meet their arbitrary standards. "How do you feel about it?" Marcus asked quietly. I considered the question seriously. I feel like justice has been served. Not revenge, justice. They tried to destroy innocent people's livelihoods, and now they're facing the consequences of those actions. I folded the newspaper and set it aside. But more importantly, their behavior that night led to something positive. It forced me to stop hiding who I was, and it inspired the creation of programs that will help thousands of people build better careers in this industry. Dr. Chen approached us with a tablet displaying real-time data. "Isabella, the response to tonight's announcement has been extraordinary. We've already received applications from over 200 potential scholarship recipients, and 12 restaurant groups have committed to implementing the new workplace standards." The evening continued with presentations, networking, and celebrations of the Foundation's mission. I watched as scholarship recipients shared their stories, as industry leaders committed to better practices, and as my staff moved through the room with confidence and pride rather than the careful deference they'd once shown to entitled customers. Near the end of the evening, as the formal presentations concluded and people began to mingle more freely, I found myself standing by the windows overlooking the city. Marcus joined me, and we stood in comfortable silence for a moment. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. The way everything unfolded that night, I thought about his question, really considered it. 3 months ago I had been living a carefully managed lie, pretending to be someone smaller than I was to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about the people I'd married into. Tonight, I was standing in my own restaurant, surrounded by people whose lives had been genuinely improved by programs I'd created, watching an industry begin to change for the better. "I regret that it took so long," I said finally. "I regret that I allowed myself to be diminished for as long as I did, and I regret that other people had to be hurt before I found the courage to act." I turned to look at him directly, "But I don't regret the outcome. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop accepting unacceptable behavior, even when that means everything else has to change." Marcus nodded, understanding flowing between us. "I'm proud of who you've become, who you've always been, really. I just couldn't see it clearly before." As the evening wound down and our guests began to leave, I walked through the dining room one more time. This space had witnessed my humiliation, but it had also witnessed my transformation. It had been the place where I'd finally stopped accepting less than I deserved, where I'd chosen dignity over false peace. The new equilibrium we'd established wasn't just about my marriage or my relationship with my staff. It was about creating a world where people's worth wasn't determined by their position in arbitrary hierarchies, where respect was given freely rather than earned through wealth or status, and where everyone had the opportunity to build something meaningful with their lives. Tonight had proven that change was possible, that better standards could be established, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to accept that things have to remain the way they've always been. Looking around at the transformed space and the transformed relationships it now housed, I realized that this was what victory actually looked like, not the defeat of enemies, but the creation of something better for everyone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.